Close your eyes and picture an ordinary Roman morning. Bread rising in stone ovens, wine being poured behind a tavern counter, enslaved workers sweeping the steps of a wealthy house while its owners still sleep. A city of perhaps 10 to 15,000 people, going about a day they had no reason to recognize as their last. This is Pompeii, and what you are about to witness is the final day before it disappeared as a living city, buried so completely that its streets would not be systematically opened again for nearly 17 centuries. Guided by plaster casts, wall paintings, carbonized furniture, and ash-sealed streets, our AI reconstruction moves beyond today's grey ruin. It rebuilds the city as closely as the evidence allows. Painted, noisy, and unaware on the day Vesuvius erupted in AD 79. August 24th is the traditional date, preserved in copies of Pliny the Younger's account, but archaeological evidence also points toward autumn. The exact day remains one of Pompeii's enduring debates. Pompeii was not a young city. Settlement on the site reached back to at least the 7th or 6th century BC, although the identity of its first founders remains debated. Oscan-speaking communities, Etruscans, Greeks, and later Samnites all shaped the city, leaving their marks on its sanctuaries, street plan, architecture, and language long after Roman power reached this stretch of Campania. Greek and Etruscan contacts also carried alphabetic writing and religious traditions into the region. Greek and Etruscan influence appeared early in the temples. Samnite rule transformed and expanded the town behind massive walls that would later help archaeologists trace its outline. Pompeii joined the Italian revolt against Rome during the Social War and was besieged in 89 BC. 9 years later, Sulla settled veterans there and formally established a Roman colony. Roman officials and colonists became the new ruling class. Latin increasingly dominated public life, and yet Oscan inscriptions still survived here and there, visible traces of an older Pompeii beneath the Roman one. By the time of its destruction, the city had spent generations drawing wealth from the fertile volcanic ground around it. Farms and villas produced wine, olive oil, fruit, and grain for local use and for trade across the bay and beyond. The same mountain whose ancient eruptions had enriched those fields would soon turn the source of that prosperity into the instrument of their destruction. 17 years before this final day, in AD 62, or possibly 63 in one ancient chronological tradition, a powerful earthquake had torn through Campania, damaging Pompeii, Herculaneum, and neighboring towns. The philosopher Seneca wrote about the disaster as proof that even ground believed secure could betray the people standing upon it. Recovery followed, but it was uneven. The Temple of Isis had been completely rebuilt, while the new central baths still stood unfinished. Some temples and public spaces showed continuing work in AD 79. Inside private houses, archaeologists have found fresh plaster, building materials, tools, and rooms caught midway through renovation. Elsewhere, homes and businesses were functioning normally, evidence of a city rebuilding while life continued around the work. Some damaged plots were absorbed into larger properties, while vineyards and market gardens expanded over land once occupied by buildings. A quieter rearrangement of wealth and space after disaster. Tremors had become part of local experience, yet it would be wrong to say that every Roman thought Vesuvius was simply an ordinary mountain. Decades earlier, the geographer Strabo had described its fire-scarred rock and suggested that the summit had once burned. Pompeii had hints of the truth, but no reliable way to know whether the ancient fire would return or when. By the early hours of this final morning, the city was already awake. Bakers had been working since before dawn, and the smell of bread drifted from more than 30 commercial bakeries scattered through Pompeii. In one oven alone, excavators later found more than 80 carbonized loaves, abandoned where the bakers had left them. Along the main streets, Thermopolia, small food and drink shops with masonry counters, served prepared dishes, bread and wine to laborers, travelers, and passing customers. Large storage jars were set into many of their counters, their rims worn by hands that had repeated the same ordinary motions day after day, long before the eruption fixed those shops in time. Near the forum, attendants prepared the public baths for the crowds that would usually arrive later in the day. Shopkeepers, laborers,
Local notables, freed people, and enslaved attendants all moved through a bathing culture central to Roman social life, though wealth and status still shaped how each person experienced it. At the Stabian baths, among the oldest complexes in Pompeii, workers fed the furnaces beneath raised floors so heat could pass through rooms and walls.
A short walk away, the Massalum, the city's food market, still bore signs of earthquake repairs. Its stalls handled meat, fish, fruit, grain, and other provisions. At the center stood a 12-sided structure, supplied with water and drainage. Fish bones and scales found nearby suggest that part of the space was used for cleaning or selling the morning's catch. In the Forum, the civic and ceremonial heart of Pompeii, merchants worked beneath the Temple of Jupiter, while magistrates, clerks, petitioners, and clients moved between the basilica and public offices. Contracts, disputes, accounts, and favors formed the machinery of local power. Painted campaign notices covered facades throughout the city, preserving candidates' names and the bakers, innkeepers, neighborhood groups, and residents who endorsed them. Politics spilled beyond official buildings and across plaster walls in red and black letters, as public as any modern campaign poster. Down toward the Sarno River and the ancient coastline, commerce tied Pompeii to the Bay of Naples. Its harbor's precise form and position remain uncertain. No conclusive monumental port has been found, but texts, roads, warehouses, river facilities, and imported goods reveal a city bound to maritime trade. Grain, wine, oil, and garum, the fermented fish sauce for which producers such as Aulus Umbricius Scaurus became famous, moved in amphorae between workshops, carts, landing places, and ships. Enslaved and freed laborers handled much of this repetitive physical trade beneath merchants, whose fortunes were advertised in elaborate tombs outside the gates, turning wealth and memory into permanent public statements. Near the city's southeastern edge stood the amphitheater, built around 70 BC, roughly a century and a half before Rome's Colosseum opened. Its seats could hold about 20,000 spectators, more than Pompeii's likely population, because games drew visitors from surrounding towns. In AD 59, taunts between Pompeian and Nucerian spectators had erupted into a deadly riot, so serious that the Senate imposed a 10-year ban on similar gatherings. By AD 79, contests had probably resumed. Nearby, a theatre portico had been adapted as gladiatorial barracks. Professional fighters, some enslaved, some condemned, some volunteers, trained and lived under rigid control, somewhere between celebrated athlete and human property. Excavators later found helmets, greaves, weapons, iron restraints, and human skeletons in the complex. But the popular image of gladiators left chained there to die is not supported by the finds. The bodies discovered near the fetters were unshackled. Even this haunting place has been made more dramatic by legend than the evidence allows. Wealthier residents lived very differently, separated from crowded commercial streets by plain exterior walls that gave little warning of the luxury beyond them. Inside large houses, families and guests reclined beside shaded courtyards, decorated with mosaics, fountains, gardens, and elaborate frescoes. Some paintings retold Greek myths, others displayed food, silver, fruit, architecture, and distant landscapes, turning a private home into a theater of status. The Villa of the Mysteries, just outside the city gates, contained one of the most vivid painted cycles to survive from antiquity, often interpreted as a Dionysian initiation, though its precise subject is still debated. Enslaved people were numerous in Pompeii, even if their exact share of the population cannot be calculated. They cooked, cleaned, taught children, kept accounts, worked farms and shops, and maintained the daily system that made elite comfort possible. Their labor powered mills, laundries, bakeries, workshops, vineyards, and entire urban households. Some performed highly skilled work as tutors and administrators, while the law still treated them as property. A few names survive in graffiti and records. Most lives appear only indirectly, through cramped service rooms, tools, restraints, and tasks preserved without the voices of those forced to perform them. For several days before the eruption, the ground across the bay had been trembling. Pliny the Younger, writing later from his own experience at Misenum, recalled that repeated earthquakes had caused little alarm because such movement was familiar in Campania.
During the final night, however, the shaking grew far more violent. Later retellings often add wells running dry and animals fleeing in panic, but the surviving eyewitness account does not securely document those details. The tremors themselves are real enough. Modern volcanologists recognize them as the kind of unrest that can accompany magma moving below a volcano, although no single earthquake could have told a Roman precisely what would happen next. Modern instruments might have detected a dangerous pattern and triggered an emergency response. Pompeii had no seismometers, no monitoring network, no evacuation plan, and no scientific model capable of turning familiar shaking into a countdown. The warning was beneath their feet, but they had no language with which to read it. Then, sometime around early afternoon, everything changed at once. Vesuvius, the green mountain that had filled Pompeii's northern horizon for as long as anyone could remember, tore open with a force no one in the city had experienced. A column of gas, pumice, and ash surged upward, eventually climbing perhaps 30 kilometers or more into the atmosphere and becoming visible from across the Bay of Naples. Sunlight made parts of it bright white, other sections darkened beneath ash and earth torn from the mountain. At Misenum, a young Pliny watched the cloud rise. About 25 years later, he described it to the historian Tacitus through the image that has defined the eruption ever since: a Mediterranean pine, its trunk climbing high before spreading into branches at the summit. From that distance, he could not tell which mountain had produced it. He knew only that the cloud was unlike anything he had seen before. Pliny the Elder, commander of the Roman fleet at Misenum and a celebrated naturalist, was initially drawn by scientific curiosity and ordered a light vessel prepared for a closer look. Then a message arrived from Rectina, trapped near the mountain and pleading for escape by sea. Curiosity became rescue. Pliny launched larger quadriremes to help her household and as many others along the threatened coast as he could. Ash and pumice fell onto the ships as they crossed toward Vesuvius. Others turned from the danger. Pliny continued toward it. It would be the last expedition of his life. In Pompeii, the first hours brought no river of lava or advancing wall of flame. Ash and pumice fell steadily, first mostly pale fragments, later darker grey stone, some pieces light enough to float, but deadly as the mass accumulated. Clear streets took on a dusting, then vanished beneath ankle and knee-deep layers, forcing residents to wade. The air grew abrasive. Roofs, never designed for a constantly rising load of debris, began to groan. Beams failed. Tiles and upper floors collapsed, crushing people who had chosen the apparent protection of home. Many residents fled during those first hours, taking coins, lamps, keys, jewelry, food, and whatever else they could carry while roads and gates remained passable. Archaeologists later found 13 adults and children in a vineyard near the Nocera Gate, in the place now called the Garden of the Fugitives. Their bodies lay above deep pumice, suggesting that they had survived the long fall of stone only to be caught while trying to move through the city. Elsewhere, possessions and casts tempted generations of excavators to invent identities. In the House of the Golden Bracelet, an adult wearing a magnificent gold bracelet and holding a child was long described as a mother. DNA, published in 2024, identified the adult as genetically male and relinquished the child. 4 victims beneath the same staircase had been arranged into a simple family tragedy, yet the tested individuals shared no close biological ties. In the house of the Cryptoporticus, 2 figures found close together were called sisters, or mother and daughter. Genetic evidence showed that at least one was male, and that the pair were not maternally related. The casts preserve bodies with astonishing intimacy, but not the stories people once confidently placed upon them. Others stayed. Their private calculations are lost. But sheltering indoors was not irrational at first. Stones were falling, streets were filling, buildings were shaking, and no one knew whether the crisis would last minutes or days. Some may have expected it to pass like earlier earthquakes. Others were elderly, injured, ill, enslaved, imprisoned, all responsible for relatives who could not move quickly. Some feared abandoning shops, homes, savings, and a lifetime of belongings. Each hour made departure harder. Each layer of pumice narrowed doorways, blocked streets,
and turned waiting into a trap.
Across the bay, shoaling water and volcanic debris obstructed Pliny the Elder's approach to the threatened coast. Wind carried him south to Stabii, where his friend Pomponianus waited for conditions that would let his ships leave. Pliny came ashore and remained outwardly calm as ash and stones fell around the villa. He bathed, ate, and reportedly slept, perhaps to reassure the household. When broad flames appeared on the dark slopes, he said abandoned farms were burning. Whether he believed that explanation or merely controlled panic, his nephew could not know. Night closed over the bay. Pliny described sheets of flame and lightning-like flashes in the dark cloud, fires and electrical activity within the eruption. In Pompeii, pumice kept falling. Streets lay beneath several feet of stone. Roofs failed. Familiar corners became slopes of loose fragments in darkness, broken by lamps, torches, and distant flashes. The hottest currents had not yet reached the city. That delay gave thousands time to escape and convinced others that their walls might still protect them. After midnight, the eruption entered its most lethal phase. The towering column could no longer sustain all the material inside it. Parts collapsed, generating pyroclastic density currents, ground-hugging clouds, and avalanches of ash, gas, and rock racing down the volcano at tens or even hundreds of kilometers per hour. They could overtop walls, pour through openings, and keep moving under their own weight. Once close, they could not be outrun. Heat, pressure, darkness, and particle-filled air made them lethal through thermal shock, trauma, and asphyxiation. Herculaneum, much closer to Vesuvius, was overwhelmed first. More than 300 people later came to light on its ancient beach and inside vaulted shoreline chambers, apparently awaiting escape by sea. Men, women, and children were packed together with coins, jewelry, lamps, tools, and the belongings they had carried towards the water. The discoveries, beginning in the 1980s, overturned the belief that nearly everyone had escaped. Heat-altered bones and teeth reveal extreme temperatures. Elsewhere in the town, a victim's brain tissue was vitrified, turned glass-like, by a brief pulse estimated above 500 degrees Celsius, followed by rapid cooling. Researchers still debate how those sheltered in the chambers died. Some evidence supports near-instant thermal shock, while other work points to hot ash and asphyxiation over a longer interval. Whatever the sequence, the first current left no survivable path through Herculaneum. Pompeii, slightly farther from the volcano and protected for a time by distance and terrain, received a brief and cruel reprieve. It did not last. Through the darkest hours and into the following morning, successive pyroclastic density currents spread outward from Vesuvius. Some earlier currents stopped short of the city or reached its edges. Later ones crossed the walls and poured through streets, rooms, courtyards, and every opening that falling pumice had not already sealed. Heat killed many of those who remained. Others succumbed to collapsing structures or inhaled ash in air that could no longer sustain them. In the final destructive phase, turbulent currents stripped walls, displaced roofs, and laid down thick deposits across the ruins. By the end, Pompeii stood beneath roughly 4 to 6 meters, about 13 to 20 feet of pumice and ash, while Herculaneum disappeared under deposits several times deeper across the bay. The next morning brought no relief. At Misenum, Pliny the Younger later recalled daylight being replaced by a darkness blacker than a windowless room. People shook ash from their clothing again and again so it would not accumulate upon them. Families called into the blackness to make sure they had not been separated. The earth moved so violently that carts rolled back and forth on level ground, even after their wheels were wedged with stones. The sea appeared to withdraw, leaving marine life stranded on exposed shore. Some prayed for help. Others called for death, or searched desperately for missing relatives. Some in the crowd believed the gods had abandoned the world, and that the final night of human existence had arrived. Pliny's mother urged him to save himself, arguing that her age would only slow him. He refused to leave her. At Stabii, his uncle was carried toward the shore when the household fled the villa. Pliny the Elder stood, collapsed, and died. His nephew associated the death with dense fumes and his uncle's weak breathing, but the exact medical cause, respiratory failure, a cardiac event, or several stresses together, cannot now be known. His body was found 2 days later, outwardly uninjured. When the eruption subsided, Pompeii and Herculaneum had been devastated, along with Stabii, Oplontis, and communities across the Vesuvian landscape. Survivors scattered toward towns around the bay.
Some returned for possessions: tunnels, breached walls, missing statues, and ancient salvage marks prove that people entered the buried city. Recent excavation has strengthened evidence that parts of Pompeii's upper ruins were occupied for centuries as a precarious settlement of ovens, mills, and improvised rooms. The Roman city itself was never restored. Its civic life ended, its streets disappeared beneath new ground, and knowledge of the old plan faded, buried under volcanic material and time. For more than 15 centuries, Pompeii survived mainly as a name in ancient texts. People farmed the land above it, although the area's later name, La Civita, the city, suggested that something substantial lay below.
In the 1590s, workers digging a water channel under the direction of the architect Domenico Fontana cut through walls, paintings, and inscriptions without recognizing the full site they had encountered. Only in 1748, a decade after royal excavations began at nearby Herculaneum, did organized digging at Pompeii itself commence. The earliest campaigns resembled controlled treasure hunting more than modern archaeology. Bourbon rulers wanted statues, mosaics, frescoes, and curiosities for royal collections. Paintings were cut from walls, objects removed with little context, and rooms sometimes damaged or buried again after their most impressive contents had been taken. Yet the discovery of streets, houses, shops, and bodies on such a scale electrified Europe. Artists, architects, writers, and aristocratic travelers came to see a Roman city emerging from the earth, helping drive the neoclassical fascination that reshaped European art, interiors, architecture, and literature. Methods improved slowly, but the most transformative innovation came in 1863. Giuseppe Fiorelli understood that cavities in the hardened ash were voids left after bodies decomposed, sometimes with bones and objects still inside. By pouring in liquid plaster and removing the surrounding material after it's set, his team captured impressions of clothing, sandals, limbs, faces, and final postures. Neither sculpture nor untouched body, each cast formed around surviving remains. A dog, still held by its chain in the house of Orpheus, twisted as rising debris trapped it. 13 victims from the Garden of the Fugitives lay where they were found. Others appeared curled inward, stretched out, or pressed close to another person. Human forms created not by an artist, but by spaces death had left in the earth. What emerged was not a perfect freeze frame. Survivors, looters, decay, early excavation, restoration, and wartime bombing altered Pompeii. Yet nowhere else preserves a more intimate view of a Roman city. Bread remained in ovens. Painted rooms retained colors protected from centuries of sun and rain. Election notices, jokes, insults, accounts, names, and declarations of love survived where their writers left them. Beside temples and villas stand workshops, tavern counters, garden beds, lamps, cooking pots, and scratched sentences, never meant for history. Together they preserved thousands of ordinary actions interrupted. Excavation and research at Pompeii have never truly stopped. About 1/3 of the city, nearly 22 hectares, remains unexcavated, protected as each generation develops more precise and less destructive methods. Uncovering a wall also exposes it to rain, sunlight, vegetation, and decay. Restraint can preserve more than discovery. Digital mapping, laser scanning, chemical analysis, X-rays and CT scanners now examine structures and casts without pulling them apart. Imaging reveals teeth, fragile bones, tools, jewelry, and objects sealed inside plaster. DNA has overturned confident stories about sex and kinship. Every method adds detail while reminding us that Pompeii's victims are evidence to study with care, not blank figures upon whom we may write the story that moves us most. Pompeii did not end in the single wall of flame imagined by legend, nor was it swallowed by lava. Its destruction came in stages: familiar tremors, falling pumice, failing roofs, darkness, and finally the hot, ash-filled currents that crossed the walls after many residents had already escaped. Within roughly a day, a living city had been broken, buried,
and preserved with an intimacy no one inside it could have imagined. Every carbonized loaf, painted wall, campaign notice, household tool, and cast is a message sent forward by people who never intended to speak to us, people following an ordinary routine beneath warnings they did not know how to read. Vesuvius still rises above the bay, green again but not extinct. Its most recent eruption came in 1944. Today it is watched continuously by scientists, while millions live across the surrounding region. The mountain has been quiet for decades. Pompeii is the reason no one can mistake that quiet for a punish.
Thank you for walking through that final day with us. If Pompeii's story moved you, subscribe, and we will meet again in the next city.